Hi, Jennifer. How are you?
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
Oh, doing great. Well, I appreciate you joining me and answering 5 questions about grief. Before we get to those questions, why don't you just tell everyone about yourself?
Okay, well, I'm Jennifer Gerhardt. I write under the name J.L. Gerhardt because every girl born in the 80s was named Jennifer. Um, I'm also a storytelling minister. So I write, I work in church, basically telling the story of what God's doing among us. So pointing out the good work that He's been doing in people's lives. I help people tell their testimonies, that kind of thing. I also help with basically anything creative that we want to do. Um, I have a husband. I've been married for 18 years. Justin's the preaching minister at Round Rock Church of Christ. And I have two little girls. They're not so little anymore. They're 9 and 11, so I have
Yeah,
two young women.
yeah,
And it's been a delight entering into this new parenting stage with them. I'll say a delight. We'll leave it at that.
yeah. And you've written multiple books, one on
Yeah.
prayer, some studies, I think on Philippians, one on thinking good, and you've recently written 2 books on grief. And
Yes.
so one swallowed up a story about how my brother died and I didn't, which just kind of tells your own personal story. And then another one, a grief received. Can you just maybe tell everyone a little bit about those 2 books and how they're different and what they can expect from those?
Absolutely. So Swallowed Up is the book I started writing because I have been feeling for years like I needed to write about that experience in my life of losing my brother. When I was 21 years old, he died. He was 20. Bobby and I had been exceptionally close. We were just together all the time. Our parents didn't really let us hang out with people. So it was just he and I, and we were partners. He
Yeah,
was the best man in my wedding. And so we were so close. And that experience was very traumatic for me, and also, weirdly, one of the most shaping experiences of my life. And so much of who I am as an adult is because of what I went through grieving him. And so I felt for a long time like I needed to tell that story. I didn't want to. I didn't really have
yeah,
any desire to, but I felt like I had to.
yeah,
And so finally it kind of chased me down and I started writing it. And once I started writing it, and people would ask me what I was writing about, and I would tell them, I just got a lot of interest. A lot of people were really like, yes, I have more questions about that. I want to know about that. And it ended up that a publisher reached out to me in the middle of me writing that one to ask me to write a different one. So
okay,
they wanted me to write something that was more of a practical resource for preachers, pastors, ministers, lay leaders, people who are going to be leading people through the process of grief.
yeah,
And so, Swallowed Up is very much my story and my experience, and my own personal transformation over time through grief. And then A Grief Received is really about walking other people through theirs. And so it could be used like in a class, in a small group setting. It could be kind of a personal workbook, so it has questions, reflection, resources, things like that. So it's a little more practical, I
yeah,
guess.
yeah. Well, great. And I'll throw up some links to both those, but you can find those on Amazon, I'm sure other places as well. And so as we begin to think about grief, do you believe, some common misconceptions that people have concerning grief?
Well, you know, to be fair, I think more and more we're getting it right with grief.
Okay.
I think we're more aware of the fact that people who are grieving need attention and love. Um, I I run into I never run into a minister who isn't absolutely aware of the fact that he needs to be reaching out and doing something for the grieving in his congregation. So there's absolutely a heart for that, I think, in the church.
Yeah.
Um, but I would say one of the things we've done, I guess there's a few. Maybe one misconception is that grief is just sadness,
Hmm.
and that's the way it'll primarily manifest. Is that you'll be sad
Yeah.
when you're going through grief, and then that's what you'll feel. And then when you stop feeling sad, you're done grieving. That's not true. For a lot of people, sadness is not the primary feeling of grief. It might be anger, it might be loneliness,
Hmm.
it might be just kind of an apathy.
Yeah.
It's different, and so people experience it differently. I think that's one Two is that grief kind of is similar for everybody, that everybody grieves the same. And so if you've grieved, you understand how other people are feeling.
Yeah.
That's not really true, right?
Yeah.
And so that statement that you hear a lot, everybody grieves differently, that's true. Let's see, other misconceptions about grief. I think there's the whole, and this is commonly debunked now, but it's still true that people believe it, is that grief is a limited process, that it's something that you do for a year, maybe two, and then you're done, and then you're fine, right?
Yeah.
Whereas grief is something that kind of sticks with you for a lifetime. It's something that is cyclical. It is the most extreme, usually in those first couple years, but it's not something you get over. It's something that you always have to deal with. I think C.S. Lewis talks about grief as losing a limb, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so you don't grow the limb back, but you do kind of learn how to live this new life without that limb.
Yeah.
And so it's not complete healing. You don't get over grief. It's always there. There's always reminders. You feel it. You know, there are times, I was, just a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to a friend, and he started doing this impression that my brother had done when he was in college. And all of a sudden, I'm crying, and I don't understand why I'm crying, and I start to realize that I'm feeling lonely, and I'm missing him, and I'm missing that joy, and it just struck me completely out of the blue.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that I don't think of my brother, it was that I don't get so sad anymore. And so when those sad feelings come up, or they really are assaulting, it's surprising, but then I remember, oh yeah, like grief is still around, it's still a part of my experience. And I've learned over the years, like, how to respond to that.
Yeah.
I guess one more thing on grief would be that that it has to be fixed. That grief is a negative thing. And I think that's a big one. And so we think grief is something we fix people of, when in reality, I think grief is just a human experience that has tons of potential. And that when it's received, it can be incredibly good for us.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good and that's helpful. You know, one of the phrases that I hear quite a bit is a new normal, you know, and so things are never going to be like they once were, but you've got to just kind of learn that things are going to be, you know, different and from here on out. So, well, what are some things that maybe some well-meaning Christians or well-meaning people say or do that are not helpful during that grieving process? And I want to emphasize the well-meaning, because I think people just naturally want to help or do something, but sometimes the things they say or do are not that helpful. You know?
Yes. I think one of the first ones is jumping to heaven. Usually one of our first responses when grief hits is to say to somebody, well, they're in heaven, isn't that great? It's wonderful. You don't have to be so sad. And we just jump to heaven as if heaven is an immediate fix for grief.
Yeah.
Heaven is good for the person who died. And it will ultimately be good for the griever, because we'll meet them again one day.
Yeah.
But it's not a solution to the reality of living in a fallen world where people die.
Yeah.
That loss that you feel is a legitimate pain, right? And we see that with, Jesus is grieving.
Yeah.
He grieves at Lazarus' tomb, right? We see God, I think, grieving when Jesus dies. When the whole sky goes black and the earth shakes and the temple is torn in two, like, that looks so much like somebody tearing their clothes, right, and weeping. And so I think that there's a precedent, a holy precedent for grief, that heaven does not undo.
Yeah.
And so we ought not try to jump in and try to lift everybody up. Like, it's okay, right?
Yeah.
Any it's okay kind of a response in the face of grief, I think, is an unhealthy one.
Okay, in what ways has the modern church made it difficult for people who are grieving?
So I think part of the answer to that is that the modern church is just made up of modern people. And modern people have some tendencies that make helping others through grief difficult. Also, they make experiencing grief and reaching out to the church difficult. The primary one being that we're just so isolationist, right? Like we're all very secluded in our own little house.
Okay.
And we often want to go to church, but we don't want to participate in church. And so we're not necessarily belonging to a community so much as we're attending something.
Yeah.
And so people aren't as plugged in. And even when they are, and even when they come and they want to serve, they don't necessarily want to be served because they think they're supposed to be self-sufficient.
Yeah.
And so when grief comes along, it really is wrecking. I mean, it's a tidal wave, right, to your life. And you have the inability to do all kinds of things for yourself, and you can't make it through grief by yourself without major consequences to your life. But if you're not willing to reach out and ask for help, then you're not going to get the help you need. And the church can do a good job of trying to show up. And I feel like our church does. I mean, we're on it real quick with bringing food, right? The elders are there to pray. We try to show up in whatever ways. But for a church like mine of 500 people, if you really don't respond to that, you can get overlooked.
Yeah.
And if you're not plugged in, like to a small group, for example, at our church, it would be easy for us to miss you, you know?
Yeah.
And I think it's that belonging has to happen before grief hits in order for you to be able to receive the gifts of the church.
Yeah.
So that's one I would say, is that I think that we're just kind of isolationist. I think another one on the membership's behalf, on just like a person who experiences grief, a problem as they relate to their church, is that we have a lack of grace, honestly. And I think you notice that like all throughout culture, we're not very good at like letting people mess up in our direction.
Yeah.
And so I don't think people can be expected to know exactly how you need to be loved during your grief. They can't mind read. They can't assume. If everyone grieves differently, then your preacher or your elder or your friend from Bible study can't be guaranteed to know exactly how to respond to you.
Yeah.
And if we're not going to have grace for those first errors, then we can't get past the errors to continue to receive the love. And so we'll shut people out instead of letting them mess up a few times and still be able to be in our life.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so true. And so, when you think about these people who are grieving, they've experienced grief, what do they have to offer the church?
So much. Because when you read scripture, Jesus is talking to people who are in pain. He's talking to people who are struggling. So much of the Sermon on the Mount is so obviously to people who are hungry and sick and tired and poor. And in a lot of our modern churches, our people are pretty comfortable.
Yeah.
And while the modern world sometimes puts a lot of stress on us, we're not necessarily in the kind of like completely dependent position that a lot of people were who Jesus was talking to. And especially, later you'll move to the first century church that's undergoing this significant persecution. They know what it is to live with daily pain.
Yeah.
And there's so much good in that. Like that's where a lot of wisdom comes from. That's where a lot of courage comes from, and that's where a lot of transformation comes from. And so in our churches, a lot of times the people who have grieved significant loss and, for lack of a better term, done it well, tend to be some of the sturdiest, wisest people in our body. And so they know how to deal with difficult things, and they recognize, I think they have a lot of perspective that maybe we don't have if we haven't been through that. They have a sense of mortality and immortality that's really healthy. But that book, A Grief Received, it's actually about 9 different gifts that come in grief, opportunities that you can kind of embrace for transformation to look more like Christ. And in that one, I kind of walk through thing after thing after thing that I've noticed God doing in people's hearts while they're grieving, that equips them to really be these extraordinary resources to the church. One being, like we just talked about, they understand community, they understand the need
Yeah.
for it, and they then tend to become the people who seek out others to comfort, right? Because they've received comfort. Paul talks about that circle of comfort.
Yeah.
It's like we received comfort so that we could give you comfort, and you received that comfort so that you could give us comfort, and it kind of works like that. So grieving people understand that so much
Yeah.
that they have to offer.
Yeah. Well, often the church and church members want to do something for those who are grieving. And so, what is maybe a thing or two that the church or church members can do for those who are grieving that would be helpful?
I think presence is the big one.
Hmm.
I mean, God models that as the primary gift that people need in pain is just presence. They need to know He's there. They need to know we're there. Um, Going back to the question you just asked, one of the things that grieving people are so good at is that they recognize that happiness is not a supreme value. That you can sit in sadness and still be a whole person.
Yeah.
And so what I think we can offer them is not needing to fix them, like being able to sit with them in their sadness without needing to alleviate their sadness.
Yeah.
When we mourn with those who mourn, that's one of the biggest things they need, is just to know that someone else is sad. Someone else recognizes that their sadness is legitimate, or their anger, or whatever feeling it is that they're feeling. And so just sitting with them and listening. Now, that can be awkward for lots of people. Like, I get that, like, not everyone is gifted at just sitting.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to look like just sitting. It could look like, hey, let's go hit golf balls.
Yeah.
It could look like, I don't know, let's make a cake together. There can be some kind of activity in presence. You don't just have to sit on the couch quietly.
Yeah.
But you also, it's not preaching, right? It's not showing up and being like, hey, here's all the ways that this could be better.
Yeah.
Or, so I think that's the big one. I think if I were to give one piece of advice, I would say make sure you show up and show up over time. I almost never respond to people's grief immediately if they're not really close to me, because I know someone else will be there. There'll be lots of people there at the beginning. And so I kind of make it a goal to come back around.
Yeah.
And so maybe a month or 2 months, 3 months down the road, I want to check in and see how they're doing, because I know a lot of that initial interest has faded.
Yeah.
And people need friends for a long time as they walk through grief.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, you think about, that first week or two, people are just kind of fixated on the person who's, struggling with some type of grief. And then everybody just kind of goes back to what they were doing before, and that person is left on their own. And, as you talk about experiencing grief in different ways, especially if it's loneliness, then they're even extremely lonely because they had all these people around. Now they have no one,
Mm-hmm.
And so just those, the times afterwards, not the first week or two, but, the next month, the next 6 months, next year.
Yeah.
That's good. Well, hey, I really appreciate you answering the 5 questions. And again, we'll get the links up to your book. So if people are wanting to know more about grief, they can read your personal story. They can look at the Grief Received, which is more of a workbook and has some really practical things in it that they can learn from, and take a look at those and learn from those and use those in your churches if you want to. So appreciate you spending the time with me today.
My privilege.
Okay, and people can look for another video next week.